Content warning. This may get graphic for some viewers, so if you are a little bit uncomfortable or a little bit squeamish around wartime history, consider this your warning and maybe come back another day. Also, side note, forgive me because I'm going to pronounce a lot of things wrong. Some people just survive history and that's all they need to do. Others feel like they are left with the responsibility of remembering and sharing their memories correctly. For some people, witnessing things horrendous, heinous, and just outright nightmarish creates a moral obligation for them. And it's an obligation to speak even when silence would be easier and when silence is the norm of the day. So let me ask you this question before we dive into today's story. Is a memory a moral responsibility, even when remembering threatens to destabilize the greater good? Hello and welcome. My name is Mavis Shahar, and if you enjoy dark history, philosophy, or the human condition, take a second, hit the buttons, help a small creator out, would ya? And for those of you who have been here, Lumen Crew, hold your lights because the path will get dark for some of this video. This is the story of Keiji Nakazawa, a boy who survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, lost nearly his entire family, and grew up in a society that wanted him to forget what he saw and tried to repress his story. He didn't share his story to heal, he told it because he believed that once survivors are gone, the truth disappeared with them. So for this story, I'm going to need you to close your eyes. Imagine you're 6 years old living in wartime Japan. You have a sister who scolds you like a second mother, a younger brother who mirrors your every move, and a hardworking father and a very loving, pregnant mother. Almost everything is great. Except you live in a constant state of hunger. Your stomach aches daily, and your neighbors scold you for begging or crying from starvation. Sirens rip you from your sleep almost every night. They aren't just like alerts, they're blaring monsters that steal your peaceful escape from the harsh daily life. Now, war is just a word to you, but you see it carved into your family's faces. Pure exhaustion every day. And then, one morning, as you're heading into school, a blinding white light followed by a deafening silence. Then searing heat and an unforeseen force flinging you off your feet and onto the ground, knocking you unconscious. You wake, barely able to move, caught in between a concrete wall and a stump. You look around to rubble. Your classmates are dead, burned, crushed. At 6 years old, you can realize you are in hell. Pretty intense, huh? This is the story of Keiji Nakazawa. He was born in Hiroshima in 1939. Even before the bomb, hunger shaped his life. By the war's final years, nearly 70% of Japan's resources were taken for the military to help war efforts, leaving civilians basically in famine and desperate. But famine wasn't the only thing government issued working against the Japanese people. The government organized the lowest level of civilian surveillance, Tanaragumi, neighborhood watches basically. Each block had a leader who monitored families. If anyone dared criticize the war or speak out openly in protest, the entire group could be punished. Even found guilty of treason, the government made sure that fear ran deeper than hunger in most cases. Keiji's father was a very opinionated man and refused to stay silent about his truth. He was a painter, poor and independent, yet severely outspoken. He told his family openly, Japan should not be fighting in this war. This war is wrong. And his family listened to every word that he had to say. And that was really dangerous. He was even drafted to help war efforts and got taken away by a special unit for an entire year out of the blue. When he returned home, he was gaunt, nearly starved after being forced to paint military equipment. With this, his defiance for the war only grew. One day, when the neighborhood head came to check on him after his return, the two ended up fist-fighting in the street. And to Keiji, this was his father, brave enough to fight even his neighbors to protect the truth. And that stayed with him forever. However, his time with his father was cut very short. On the morning of August 6, 1945, air raid sirens wailed across Hiroshima, but they quickly stopped. False alarms. They were common back then. So, Keiji ended up walking to school, and at the gate, a classmate's mother called to him. As they spoke, he randomly looked up, and there, in the sky, was a bright, shiny B-29 bomber. But no sirens. And then everything changed. A flash brighter than the sun, silence, and a devastating wave of heat and pain. By pure chance, Keiji had stepped behind a reinforced concrete wall, which shielded him. A toppled tree trunk kept the wall from crushing him, and that saved his life. When he opened his eyes, the woman that he had just been speaking to was dead. Her entire backside was burned away, and like a homing instinct, he had no thoughts. He just ran straight home. And along the way, he saw things that nightmares were made of. People with skin hanging in sheets, dragging behind them, their hair falling out, their eyes melted, and some staggered silently, moaning for water, just a little bit of water. And some plunged into the river, desperate to cool their burns. Hiroshima had become hell on earth. When Keiji reached his neighborhood, his house was demolished. It was gone. And in Barefoot Gen, he later drew himself there, watching his father, sister, and younger brother trapped in the flames. But in real life, he wasn't there. That scene, he learned it later from his mother. That was her perspective. The blast had thrown her into the alley and she survived. His father, sister, and little brother were pinned beneath beams, and the mother, she and a passerby tried desperately to free them, but the fire, it grew, and it grew too fierce. Their screams were the last thing that she heard while being pulled away down the street. A neighbor told Keiji his mother was at the Funari Kawaguchi Cho streetcar stop. He found her sitting on a futon holding a newborn. Shock had forced her into an early labor, and with the help of a passerby, she delivered baby Tomoko in the street. But being malnourished and traumatized, she couldn't produce any milk. Baby Tomoko passed away just 4 months later due to malnourishment. Later, Keiji's older brother returned from Kure. Following their mother's instructions, the boys dug through the rubble with buckets and shovels, retrieving the bones of their father, sister, and younger brother. For a short time, Keiji and his mother stayed with distant relatives, but even their survival was harsh. His mother was once accused of stealing an umbrella that she hadn't taken. She was arrested, fingerprinted, and forced to write an apology for a crime that she did not commit. The humiliation and fear of persecution drove them to leave. They built a shack in Takajo, starting over yet again. It was there that Keiji entered Honkawa Elementary, already marked by loss and stigma. He was an outsider, and outsiders, unfortunately, they weren't welcome. He suffered burns at the nape of his neck and the back of his ears, and when they were like midway healed, kids threw rocks and tore the burns back open. Kids can be really cruel creatures sometimes. It's awful. Like, could you imagine? At school, Keiji was still bullied, and survivors of the bomb came to be known as hibakusha, meaning literally bomb-affected people. It was not a badge of honor, though. It was a curse. Employers refused to hire hibakusha, afraid that they'd die young. Landlords wouldn't rent to them. Families feared marriage, thinking the children would come out deformed. And survivors were treated as walking contagions, basically. But Keiji fought back. Literally, he got into fights like without hesitation. It was kill or be killed in Keiji's world, and Keiji was a survivor. There were many harsh times, but one day, he found his light when he was just in 3rd grade. He discovered manga from a classmate. He was mesmerized, and drawing became his outlet, and frankly, his dream. He drew on whatever paper he could. He stole old posters from alleyways to practice on the back of. He drew all the time. His mother was against him becoming an artist. She knew from experience that being an artist is equivalent to living in poverty, unfortunately. But by his teens, he worked as a sign painter by day, climbing without scaffolds yet because they didn't exist, risking life and limb for yen. And after working long hours of intense manual labor, he did not go right to bed, like most. At night, he stayed up until midnight and drew manga to perfect his dream craft. And at 17, he sold his first story for 2,000 yen. And in 1961, with his mother's reluctant blessing, he left Hiroshima for Tokyo. By 1963, he debuted professionally with a manga called Spark One, and for years he climbed the ranks, sharing wildly successful stories for a boys' magazine. In 1966, though, tragedy struck again, and his mother had passed away. At the crematorium, Keiji was handed an urn, and inside there were no bones, just fragments. And later on, he went to say, "The bomb stole my father, my brother, my sister, and it even stole the bones of my precious mother." Furious, he turned all of his grief into art. He had the realization that his mother's truth died with her. Would his truth also die with him? In one sitting, he drew Struck by Black Rain, and in 1972, the monthly Shonen Jump magazine he worked for asked its artists to write autobiographical works on their lives. Keiji responded with I Saw It, a stark account of the bombing through a child's eyes. And his editor was shook. He was shaken, and he asked for more. And in June 1973, Barefoot Gen, the work he is most famous for, was born. From the very first publishing, Barefoot Gen was very controversial. Readers complained that it was too grotesque for children. It was eventually pulled from the Shonen Jump and picked up in magazines aimed at older readers. By the late 1970s and 80s, school boards tried to ban it from libraries, calling it too graphic, yet teachers and peace activists embrace it as a tool for teaching the realities of war. Even decades later, the controversy continued. In 2013, the Matsui Board of Education restricted Gen in school libraries, citing its depictions of Japanese war crimes. After public outcry, the ban was eventually reversed, though. So at least that's good. Outside Japan, publishers were too hesitant as well. The first English translation did not come from the big companies, but from grassroots activists with Project Gen. To this day, Gen is marketed more as educational literature for adults than for educational literature for children because it was made so you don't look away from the realities and the hardships of war. Keiji Nakazawa never stopped drawing or speaking. He lived with the pain of his childhood until his death in 2012 at age 73 from lung cancer, a disease many believed was tied to radiation exposure. His legacy is Barefoot Gen, a work that forces us to look at things that we would rather turn away from. He once said, "Many readers complained, this is not something children should see. But I thought, that's exactly why they must." I think they feared his drawings because they weren't just pictures, They were evidence. They were a first-hand account of the devastation of the atomic bombs, about how grotesque war can be on civilians and even entire nations. The bare-bones truth of war, chaos, and destruction encapsulated into film. But not from an adult survivor's perspective, no, from a young, innocent child's perspective. Keiji never claimed that sharing his experience during Hiroshima would make the world any better. He didn't believe that memory would bring peace or closure or healing or anything like that. He believed in a much simpler and heavier truth. That once people who witness something like Hiroshima are gone, the truth becomes whatever is easiest for people to live with. And after his mother died, Nakazawa realized something absolutely terrifying to him. Her memories would die with her. And someday his would too. Unless he got it out there. Barefoot Gen was not created to shock people, and it wasn't created to provoke anyone. It was created because he believed surviving something like this came with a responsibility. To remember it accurately, even when the accuracy, it made people uncomfortable. And his drawings weren't feared because they were exaggerated. They were feared because they refused to turn the other cheek. They refused to soften for the public. And when people asked him to soften his images, to make them more appropriate, and to, protect the greater good, Nakazawa made his choice. He chose memory and his own truth over comfort, accuracy over peace of mind, and responsibility over silence. Which brings us back to the question that we originally started with. Is memory a moral responsibility even when remembering threatens the greater good? Nakazawa never answered that question for anyone else. He only answered it for himself. And then he drew. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this video this week, and if you believe sharing your memory is a moral responsibility. Let me know down in the comments. And if there's anybody else who deserves the spotlight for dark history, please also comment them down below. I'll see you guys next Monday. Bye!